What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to do what all of this inventory stuff has been building to in the action RPG slash third person tutorial series. We are going to use data tables to configure every item. That way we can use them in our inventory, make them pop up in the game just like we have been able to do, okay? It's going to be the same thing as that, but now we're going to be using data tables. So first of all, it's going to clear up our memory. It's going to be a lot better on memory management. And also, we are going to be able to separate the logic so that we can actually have swords, equipment, items separate. So that when we update our UI, possibly in the next episode, then we will be able to filter by item type and, go to different screens for weapon, armor, slash equipment, and items. So this is really useful. We can change the data very easily without changing anything in the class. We can change it right in the data table. This also allows someone else to edit it if you're working in a group of people and you have someone who's a designer or some sort of manager who can change the values and you want to work on the logic side of things. You don't have to ever have them touch the files. As far as conflicts go for source control, you can use the data table instead. So this is really useful for a lot of different reasons. And this will pretty much wrap up our inventory logic episodes. I know this is going to be part 6 of the inventory, but it is going to actually wrap up the logic. So in the next episode of inventory, we'll go over the UI. We'll make it look nice. We'll be able to actually use it and change things about it. Like, I want to actually assign the images to these parts when you have this equipment on and different things like that. So yeah, we'll make this look better, but in terms of the actual logic, this is what everything has been building to. We're going to combine pretty much everything that we worked on in all these episodes into one and make it a little bit neater. Since we're using data tables, we don't need everything that we were doing in the past. And we can also get rid of a ton of our memory by not saving out an object reference to every object for each button in the inventory. So we're only going to save it out for the object that gets created when we click on it. Alright, so with all that out of the way, we've got a lot to cover today. This is going to be a pretty long episode. So to get started, I will go to the code. And before we actually start diving into all this, if you want to catch up, I will leave the playlist right here to the third person tutorial series so you can see everything we've done so far in the series. And I will also leave this episode from the previous week on how to use data tables as a whole. We were setting up data tables in this episode, and we were able to get things working, but not within our current system. It was just a generic data table episode. So now we can use everything within our system, and you can learn more about that than I'm going to go into today. But I'll still cover everything you need today in this episode. Alright, so let's get started. First things first, our classes in the code. So we have a lot going on. The way our structure is set up, we have a default item, default weapon, and default equipment. So item is the parent of weapon and equipment. However, item itself, if an item is a class of default item, it's specifically just going to be something that's not a weapon or equipment. I call equipment basically anything you can equip on the character. So armor, yes, but also if you want to have like necklace or pendant, something like that. I'm trying to think of things that these type of games have. Basically, it doesn't really have to be armor necessarily, like rings from Dark Souls. It doesn't have to be armor, just something that will change things about your character by equipping it. That's what equipment is. Weapon are, of course, things that you hold and can attack with. And then items are kind of just other things, so we're talking potions or potentially things like that. You could even lump spells into its own if you want to do something similar. We'll leave that out for now, but I'm just trying to give you an example so that you can see the whole picture. Now, I have covered and created all these classes in different episodes, so I'm not going to go into everything here, but I'm going to go over everything that we added to each of these classes before we get into the blueprint logic. So first of all, let's start at the top, default item. So for default item, I've added an enum class, item type. The reason for this is we have enums like in the weapon. We had an enum for e-weapon type, and we determined what type of weapon it was based off this enum. Now this was important because in the future, this is going to determine our animation. It could determine some of our base stats, could determine, you know, different things like that. There's so many things that you could do. Oh, you're using this weapon, so you get credit toward this challenge or something. There's a lot we could use it for. So that's useful. The item didn't really have anything to identify it. It was just being the parent class. So what I've done is I've made an enum that separates the logic. It separates these items away from each other. So we have the item, the weapon, and the equipment. I've also added other. You know, if we want to get more specific down the line, we can just add more. But other is just a kind of a wild card right now if we need it for any reason. It's always good to have some sort of wild card if you think that there might be things you haven't accounted for, or certain cases where you might need one that doesn't fit the others. Make sure that you also make an instance of this enum. I just call it item type. So we make the enum and then make a variable that can hold the value of the enum. The name and the weight are the same as they always have been, so I'll skip them for now. These functions are the same as they have been, but I did add an ID of the item, this very bottom variable here. Int ID. Now ID is really important. ID is going to link to it's going to be our identifier for the data table. So we will assign the ID for the actor or for the class, and then the data table will know what actor we're referring to. If you don't like this method, you could use the name, but every time you want to change the name, you do have to be aware and make sure that you name it the same thing in the data table. So I prefer the ID method. Not everyone is going to agree with that, and that's okay. Like I said, change it to how you like it. This is what I'm used to doing for different projects and things, so this feels natural to me. As far as the default variables go, I just set item type to be e-item because this is the parent class, so the default really should be the parent. ID I set it to be 0 by default. It's going to be overridden in every class, so. Then let's go to default equipment. Alright, so for default equipment, we had e-equipment type already. So this handles if it's a helmet, chest, legs. I don't have a wildcard in that one, but that's good enough for now. I did not change anything within this class. You can set the parent defaults if you'd like. Like you can set a default ID in here if you'd like. And you can set a default item type if you'd like. I'm going to do it all in the blueprint anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But you do have the opportunity open to you. And then with weapon, I have a struct example, a code struct example in here for something that I'm going to show when we get to the structures. But I have not changed anything in here either, other than that. So there you go. Control KO to open up the paired file. Like if you're in the .h, it'll open the CPP and vice versa. But just to show you, I did not change anything. Alright, those are the main things for code. They're pretty small, but they are important. The ID in particular is very important, and the enum to differentiate the type of item is also very important. Alright, let's go back into Unreal, and let's start using some of this stuff now. So first of all, if you watch the data table episode, then you'll know that I already have a data table that was choosing, we were manually picking a weapon from the row and spawning it. And that's good, but, you know, it's not going to work in the real game because we're going to have to know, oh, we clicked on this item, this is the weapon we want to spawn, or this is the helmet we want to spawn and attach. Different things like that. So to do that, we have to look at our data table and our structures. So first of all, the weapon data table is what we made in the previous episode, in the data table episode. I've made rows with all these variables, and I filled them out for each weapon. Now, if you've not watched the data table episode, again, I highly recommend you do, because it has more data than I'm going to go over today. However, I will go through this in full detail so you at least get the basics. That way you don't have to watch that episode if you're really not interested. Essentially, what we do to get to this state where we can fill out this file with all sorts of data is we can go to Add New, Blueprints, and make a structure. I called mine F Weapon. Now, we have the default weapon class, right? We were just in that, and it has all these variables. But data tables have to use structures, not classes. So I made a blueprint structure, transferred everything over that I wanted, and then also added any other variables that I needed as well. So you click New Variable, get all your variables together that you want. For the weapon, I put the name, the weight, the level requirement to use it, the damage, the speed, the type of weapon, like sword, axe, dagger, and the class that it's going to spawn, which is going to be a class reference to our base weapon BP. So you hit New Variable, you type the name, you select the type. For the more advanced types, like E-weapon type, as long as you have it as a blueprint enum, you can access it right in here. It's not a problem. And for the class to spawn, I'm going to be spawning the actor when I select this from the inventory. So I need to know what type of class it is. You don't want to do the actor reference. There's certain things that don't work in data tables, and actors are one of them. Well, basically object references like that are one of them. So instead we can use the class reference to just spawn an instance of that class. We don't need an actual actor here. And the way this is done, I made it a base weapon BP so anything can be passed into it. So you go to the type that you want. Base weapon BP is my child blueprint class of our default weapon code class. Alright? So once you find that blueprint class, because this has the mesh and all, that's why this is so important, I can go to this and I can select the class reference as opposed to the object reference. And that's how you get this purple color. And that's what you want. And that's how we made the weapon in the data table episode, the F weapon structure. Now what I did in code in the default weapon.h here is showing you how you could make this the default weapon code class hold the structure. So you could make this structure blueprint type and fill out the data in here, as opposed to having the class as one thing and the structure as another thing. The thing with that is, if it's not really a big deal other than an annoyance for making it twice, the structure itself isn't holding any data. The structure doesn't take up any data. The data table is going to be read from. Essentially what a data table is, before we get into it, is it's this collection of data, like an Excel sheet or a CSV file. You pull from a row or a column and you grab the appropriate data. So all the data that's in there is stored in the file, so the data table has some logic, you know, to sift through it. But other than that, it's very quick and it's pretty easy to do for the computer. So there's no real need to make a code structure and change all your class items out from, you know, all your variables into the structure. You could if you want. It's probably the cleaner method because you don't have the class and the structure. But I like to think of the structures in Unreal Engine more as data types. Essentially, you know, a class and a structure are pretty similar. But in Unreal in particular, a lot of times the things that they have in place, Epic put in place for structures, are very much just like to hold data to pass to an object. So in my opinion, it's perfectly fine to just leave this out entirely and make a new blueprint structure for each different type of item, like I've done. So this is F weapon, and I made the weapon data table, but I've also made F item and F equipment. F equipment, same thing as F weapon, but with the appropriate variables. So yeah, I've made this default equipment. If we're staying consistent, I should probably make it base equipment BP, but it doesn't really matter. So for the equipment, I have the name, the weight, the level requirement to use, or to equip, the damage resistance that it gives, the type of equipment, and then the class to spawn. And lastly, the F item is very simple because I haven't done much with it. We haven't done much with items, so I'm not going to go too deep into it today, but I do have the name and the weight, and then I have the class to spawn. And again, I put default item. I don't have a base item BP in this one, so default item is fine. I always like to go to the lowest possible class I can and still get everything. That's why you saw me switch it to base equipment BP, because base equipment BP is under default equipment, but it still encompasses everything I need. So I think it's perfectly fine to make these structures, but I did want to show you how you could make a code structure instead if you're interested in that. And then you just use that structure in the data table. But now that we're good with all that, we'll go back into the editor. You can see my structures here. And this process is going to be the same for all of them. So if you did watch the data table episode, you probably won't even need to watch what I do here. But I did update a few things, just a few values and things, so it could be useful. For each data table, and the way you make a data table, you're going to make one for every structure. So for each type of item that you want. So I have item as a default, weapon, and then equipment. You could actually put them all together and just have an identifying number. Like I have an ID, right, that I said, and that's this on the left side. This is what this is going to pair up to. You could actually make this a little bit more advanced and be like W_0 or W0 or something. Say weapon 0. You could actually change it. It doesn't have to be just an integer. It could be a string. And you could make this identifier. Personally, I like making just multiple data tables. As far as I can tell, it's not really a big deal to have multiple data tables that you pull from. I've not really seen any performance decreases or anything like that due to this, so I'm going to keep doing it like this. If I find out that it's a really bad method to have multiple data tables and I just didn't know it in the past when I was using them, then we can just update it. It'll actually be pretty simple the way we're going to use it today. We're just going to access the proper data table based on the type of item, which we could just combine into one. So if you want to do that anyway, up to you. It's going to be pretty easy, I believe. All right. So for each of these, like I said, we make a data table. You go to add new, miscellaneous data table, and then you pick the row for the structure that you want. For me, I want to make one for F weapon, F equipment, and F item. Now, I said this in the data table episode. For some reason, there's 2 of almost every structure. I don't know why. You can't pick the wrong one as far as I'm aware. You can pick the top or the bottom one, and it seems to work fine. I'm not sure why there are 2 that show up here, but either way. Select the right one, like weapon. You hit OK, and then it'll come up like this. In fact, I actually thought I hit cancel, and it still came up. And then you can rename it. So I called mine weapon data table. In the weapon data table, you can expand these if they're not big enough for you. But you'll have nothing in here to start. You'll have to hit this little plus button to add a new row to the table. So it'll be completely empty. Look like there's nothing there. You add 3 of these or however many items you have. I happen to have 3 items. And I also have, here's my equipment data table. And I also have 3 of those, helmet, chestplate, leggings. I don't have any in the items. I did make the item data table and I made 2 items. But I don't actually have these things ready or available, so you won't be able to see them in game. However, you can see I made 2 because I have a need for 2. All right. And so, in each of these, once you add your rows, it will ask you to name the row. This is the most important thing for right now. This is going to be our identifier in this case. This is essentially our ID as the way I set it up. So in the default item, how I added that integer ID, and the default equipment and default weapon are both children of the default item class. So they have access to an ID as well. If we set the ID in each actor, or in each object, then we'll be able to pass the ID into the proper data table and retrieve the proper variables. That way, again, we don't have to store all these object references for every button. That is not good, how we were doing that. And I mentioned not liking it while we were doing it, but we didn't have anything to go against it at the time. So now we can. So here's our ID, and then you just fill out the data for each row. So here's the row name. You click on the row you want, and you fill out the data. So basic sword 3072. I made a type of sword, and I made it the sword BP. Okay? And you just do the same thing for all these. You set the data that you want, and you're good to go. You can save this and work on your equipment data table. It's the same stuff here. I'll show you all my values in case you want to see them, but it really is the same stuff here. Alright, I'm going to close these, at least for now, because they take up a lot of the tabs, and I don't want to get anything more confusing than it has to be. One thing before we get started on the blueprint logic, if you did follow the data table episode and you did put it in your third-person tutorial series, make sure you remove the logic we added last week. So I've moved it up. I just moved it up and out of the way. We connected it after setup input actions and begin play to do this logic. And this is how we were just spawning the weapon in the data table that we wanted to and attaching it to our character. But since we're going to actually be using our inventory now, it doesn't really make sense to continue doing that. But I left it up there since we did use it in a previous tutorial. But yeah, just take it out and set it back to the way it was. Small change, but it is important. If you did do that, then you would get some weird bugs today. So I thought I'd mention it. Alright, and now the majority of our changes are going to be in the items themselves, which I'll show you in a second, and the inventory. So the inventory window and the single inventory item. The inventory window is what pops up when we press this. It's this actual whole widget. And the single inventory item is the basic sword here. And basically anything that's the button that you can click on. So those are the two things. Those are the differences that we've set up throughout the series and the inventory specifically. And they're both going to come into play here. We're going to have to make some modifications to both. Before we do that, that'll be pretty much, that'll wrap everything up and finalize our logic. But before we do that, let's go into our items. So specifically, I'm going to go to base weapon BP. And I'm going to go to my class defaults. So now that I'm in class defaults, you can see I have access to everything that we set up in the code. And I've labeled all of these default item things, the variables, as category item. And since it is a parent of default weapon, which is a parent of base weapon BP, then I can see the item things in here. So what I want to do is I want to set the item type to the appropriate type. Now, again, we are using base weapon BP, which is essentially, it's got no mesh or anything on it. It is the parent container class, essentially, for the weapon that we want to spawn. Sword BP, dagger BP, axe BP. So if we change the item type here to weapon, all the children change. Without me needing to modify it, they all become weapon. So as long as you keep making children of base weapon BP when you're making more weapons, you'll never have to manually set this again. Just make it a child of base weapon BP. If you do, though, it's very easy. Just change it in here. So that's very, very simple. One thing we do need to keep track of is making sure we're setting the IDs properly. So each actor, you know, the data table can only do so much. So yes, we can find it by name, we can find it by ID, whatever, but we still have to know what object we're even referring to when we're writing the data table. It can't predict things for us. So I have a sword and I have a dagger and I have an axe. All right. Now the game does not know what we're writing these data table objects about. So if I go back into the weapon data table, I have 3 here. I still have to line up my IDs, otherwise we won't know what we're looking for. So I put sword, dagger, axe. That's the order I put them in, which means the IDs have to line up with that. So ID of 0 lines up with the basic sword. ID of 1 lines up with the basic dagger. And ID 2 lines up with the basic axe. Now, you want to go flaming longsword, something like that. You put that ID 3, and then in the actor BP for flaming longsword, imagine it's this, you put ID 3. That's all you do. You just line up your IDs, and the rest will be filled in later. This also means we no longer need to fill out this data. I was already filling it out, but you can undo it if you want. Take the default values. Whoops. Or you can reset them and keep them how you set them up previously. It doesn't matter. They're going to be overwritten by the data table info. If for whatever reason you don't do that, you can have something like a boolean that says don't overwrite, and you can specifically set the logic in here. I don't know why you'd really want that, but I want to keep it open, as always, for everyone working on this tutorial. However, the data table is just usually a better method. There are some advantages of doing it in here specifically, but then it's a lot more work on the specific actor, which we're trying to avoid right now because we're assuming you can have as many items as you want at the moment. Anyway, set those up, and then they should link to the data table. I mean, there's a lot we have to do to grab it, but it should link in terms of, okay, when we get to that spot, the ID for that object matches the ID in the table. And same thing with the equipment. I won't go through the whole thing because it's pretty much the exact same. But if we go into our equipment, base equipment BP, change the item type to equipment. All children of this will also change to equipment. And then change your IDs. So helmet, chestplate, leggings. So if I look at this, helmet has an ID of 0. Chestplate has an ID of 1. And leggings have an ID of 2. So I've just lined up all my IDs with what's in the data table. All right. And at this point, I believe we're ready to cover the inventory changes. So they're going to be pretty broad. Luckily, they're only going to be in really 2 areas, but we are going to have to kind of go through them. So I'm just going to walk through this again. We only made changes right here as far as inventory window goes, but I'm going to walk through it again just so you can kind of understand what's going on, because I know it has changed a lot over the last few episodes, and I apologize that I couldn't make it any cleaner, but I think this is the finalized way we're going to keep it. We may add more to it, but I don't think we're really going to change it since now we finally have the data table in. So the way this works is on constructed this window, and we're popping up the window by pressing 2 right now on the keyboard. But that will also be a button on your controller. When you open that up, then event construct of this widget will fire. So we're getting the owning player pawn, which is the character that spawned the widget, casting it to the character that we want to have a reference of. So base character BP. I'm setting it to be character reference. Now, I do have a character reference in my inventory window. This isn't really necessary. You could easily just use this cast and make it work. I did it for things down the line because I wanted to be able to attach things to the character directly using those images on the side. So that's a little bit unrelated to today's episode, but that's what we're doing here. And then we go into the inventory component of that character. We break the inventory and we grab the item list. The item list in the inventory is an array of default items. So then we loop through them all, and for each one, we create a single inventory item widget. That's this guy. So for every item we have in our inventory, we create one of those. And we were setting the name and the weight of each of these after. That's fine, but there's a lot of things we can set now, and, very, very good chance we're going to add more, like adding pictures instead of just the regular button, right? So you can see it in the viewport, different things like that. So I've made a new function called set item details in single inventory item. We'll get to that in a second, but just know that this has replaced the set name and set weight that you were seeing in here before. Set name text and set weight text. So if you're looking at yours and wondering why it's different, I changed those nodes out for this. I also took out set object reference because we're going to be setting it elsewhere now. Then I'm adding all of these single inventory items as a child of this vertical box, which basically means we can scroll through our inventory, and then making sure we have the ability to select it or deselect it. So the really important part is here, but I wanted to cover everything just so you kind of get back into the feeling of what's going on, because it has been a while since we've edited this part specifically. But we have made a ton of changes to the inventory and the way things are equipped and attached. So I thought it was important. All right. Now, instead of the set name text, set wait text, and set object reference, let's go into single inventory item for a second and take a look at the new structure. We changed this up a little bit, but we'll cover that in a second as well. So don't worry about on pressed. Let's go specifically to the function so that we can clear up inventory window, and then we'll go over single inventory item as a whole afterward. So for set object reference, this is what we had in the past. We were taking in an object, a default item, and we were setting this object reference variable on it. This is the single inventory item widget. So this is one card, basically, one inventory slot in the menu. We don't want all these to have an object reference. That's how it was in the past, but doing that takes up, it's storing so much data every time you open the inventory. So instead, I stopped calling that in the inventory window, and we don't use that currently. But I left it there so you could see it. We are going to use object reference because we still need to spawn an object when we select it, but that's different. We don't want to spawn them all right away or set all the references right away. Now, I still have set name text and set wait text as well, and we actually are going to use them. They have not changed. But instead of using them outright, what I've made is a new function, plus function, called set item details. And this is going to do all the logic for us, to set all of the item details, as opposed to just setting the name or wait or, you know, us infinitely adding to it. We call one function inventory window, and we're good. Now, set item details, we're going to take in a type. It's our e-item type. That's this right here. This is going to determine what type of item it is. If it's just an item, a weapon, equipment, or other. So it's going to take that in, and it's going to take the ID of the item in. And this is going to determine what item to pull the data from, what value to pull stuff from. And we're only going to pull what we want to populate. So I'm only going to populate two things for now, but when we get more advanced here and with the UI and we're adding images and, you know, you probably want to share the stats, then we'll have to populate a little bit more. But let's set this up first. So make sure you have these two input parameters. You just press plus new parameter to add these. And this function is completely new, so you won't have anything related to this. Go into your inventory window. This is a function within your single inventory item. So you can drag off the return value of this created single inventory item widget and call set item details right here. That's this. And then off of the item list, because in default item is the thing that has the item type and the ID. That's what we set up earlier in this episode. So grab both of those variables. Like that. And then drag them both in to the parameters. And now you're good for inventory window. Once you've done that, you can really just leave it alone as long as you're confident that that's correct. Then the rest of our logic is going to be in the single inventory item. Now, we have some remnants from these other episodes, like is in use and object reference, and we will be, well, object reference we're going to keep, is in use we're going to fix in the next episode where we do an actual inventory overhaul to make it look nicer. For right now, it's the best thing we've got with what we can show, so it's fine. But you can pretty much ignore them for now. The important parts are that we're going to add two variables. I'm going to actually keep track of the type and the ID separately for this inventory item, because I do want to know, I do use it for determining certain things. It's not necessarily important that you do this, but there's more things I want to use it for down the road in the inventory, so I'm just being a little bit proactive here. But these parameters that come in, I have a new variable for ID, which is an integer, and item type, which is an item type. So basically the two parameters in here, I'm saving them out to variables. The way you can do this is if these types are the same, like this is an item type, I can just set my new variable that I made, set item type, or I can literally pull off of it and promote to variable. Same with ID. Once I've set them both, remember, these ones are local to the single inventory item. They're not changing anything with the item itself. They're changing it for this widget. That way we can grab the proper data. Then I'm using my item type, and I just use reroute nodes, but you could also just drag it onto the screen and drag off of it and type switch. Switch on item type. What this is doing is this is making a switch statement based on the type of item that it is, item, weapon, or equipment. And that's good because we're going to grab the appropriate data table to perform this logic. So, to wrap this function up, we're going to, again, set all the variables for this widget that it needs to know. Right now in my designer, I only have the ability to see the name and the weight, so I'm only going to show the name and weight. I'm only going to grab that and set that. So it's pretty simple what we do here, but we're going to access something from our data table. And so this is going to be the same logic, but for the correct item. So let's say it's an item type. Then we're going to do get data table, and you'll see get data table row. Then we're going to want to put our item ID in here. It can't actually convert that so easily, but an integer can be easily converted to a string by typing toString, and that can be brought into the name field. So now what we're doing is grabbing the ID and we're searching the rows in the data table for this ID. So if the item ID is 0, then we're saying, oh, we found this row. The row name is 0, so we found this row. Make sure you select your item data table, or whatever data table is relevant here. And then drag off of this and type break. And it will give you all the variables basically in that structure from that data table. I'm going to delete this since we have it right up above, and it should be pretty self-explanatory at this point. But now I'm going to call my set name text and set weight text functions that I mentioned earlier that we were calling previously in inventory window. So essentially, I just do this, pass in the name, it will automatically convert, and then I drag off the, I type set weight text and drag off of the weight. And that's how you're going to do it for all of these. The thing that changes is the data table we use. So for weapon, instead of using the item data table, we're using the weapon data table. And we will have to break it again. Even if you copy and paste, you'll have to drag off of this and break again. It'll break F weapon. And then you can click the little arrow to get access to all your variables. Same for equipment. All right. So that's set item details. There's one other function we need to make today, and this is retrieve item from ID. This is going to occur after we select the item. Now, it is actually very similar to what we just did. The only difference here is that we're going to set the variables on the object that gets spawned, so that all the values that that object has get transferred over. So for example, so make a new function, plus function. I called it retrieve item from ID. Now, I already have the ID and the item type since we set them in the set item details. So we don't have to have any parameters, but you can see I drag my item type in and I do a switch on it again. It's the same logic. I use my ID. This is for item. Okay, this is if the type is an item. I use the item ID to get from the item data table and I break it. The difference here is that I set all the variables that are relevant to this object. So I use the class to spawn that's here and say spawn actor from class. Now it needs a transform. So I always try and spawn it right on the character because I think that's the best spot. Since we're going to attach it, it's fine to spawn it there. If you want, you can spawn it wherever, really. It doesn't really matter. It should attach so quickly to the correct spot that you shouldn't really see it. But it's up to you. So I just did get owning player pawn, get actor transform. These are built-in functions, so you can type this in. You'll get the owner of the widget, so if you're doing multiplayer, it'll still work for the right character. Then you just pass it into the spawn transform. All right. Now, with that done, I do something here that's a little bit strange, but I wasn't able to just set my return value here to my object reference. So I still have this object reference variable because this is the object we're spawning now, and we may need to do more things with it, like set variables on it or access it down the line if we drop it so we can spawn it into the scene, different things like that. So I still do this when we spawn the actor. But yeah, I'm doing this cast to cast to a default item because object reference is a default item type. Basically, it's a default item since weapon and equipment are children of default item. Any object can be assigned to it. For whatever reason, when you spawn actor with a class to spawn brought into it, then the return value will sometimes just say actor. Right now, it says default item object reference, so it's saying you don't need to cast to this. But in the past, it was giving me issues because this was just an actor and it couldn't be assigned to this type. So if you're seeing this, if you're getting an error when you just try to do return value to object reference, then just cast to the type. Right now, it's saying, no, you can't cast that, or you don't need to cast that type. You already have it. But I was getting problems with that, so it doesn't matter. This isn't going to hurt anything. It's an additional cast, so at the most, it'll slow it down very, very little. You'll never notice it from one cast unless you're doing something crazy with it. So it's fine. I'm not worried about it. I'm actually going to leave it in just in case it decides it doesn't want to work at some point. However, you don't necessarily need this cast. I think spawn actor just takes some time to figure out what actor is being spawned, or maybe it needs to be run once to figure it out. So regardless, take the return value, set your object reference, and then either off this cast if you're casting beforehand, or you'll have to cast this default item to the right class, like if it's a weapon or equipment, so that you can set all the variables. In this case, it's just an item, so I can just use my name and weight and pass them in. So I drag off my casted item, and I pass it in. So I drag off this and type set name. So this is setting the name of the actual item in-game. And we're setting it based off of what we grabbed from the data table. And same with the weight. Setting the weight of the actual item in-game based off what we grabbed from the data table. Now, all these are going to be the same process again. So make sure you're using the right data table, weapon data table. I break weapon. I spawn the actor. I cast to base weapon BP because I need to at least have the class that I want to use. Because if I don't, then I won't be able to grab these variables. The object reference is an item, so it's a parent. It doesn't have the variables that the child class has. So if the weapon has base damage, item doesn't have that. So at one point or another, I'm going to need to cast the base damage just to set variables. Don't worry, it won't hurt the actual variable. It's just casting to it so that we can access different things within it. So cast the base weapon BP and set every field. Set name, set weight, set level requirement, set base damage, set base speed, set weapon type, and pass them all along. Okay, I made it pretty neat here, I think, but you can just drag them across if you want. And lastly, same with equipment. So we get the equipment data table, we break equipment, we cast the base equipment BP, we set the object reference, and then we set the variables. Name, weight, level requirement, base damage, resist, and equipment type. Alright, so there you go. And that's how this function is going to work. So those are our two functions. Now we just have to change where we're calling these functions. And I'm changing around a little bit of the logic we have in when the button is pressed just to make this a little bit cleaner. So on press of item button is the actual button here. So this is the button we're clicking on. This can stay as we change the menu and make it more advanced. Even if we add an image, whatever, there's still going to be a button that we can press, so we can just keep it as this button. Once we press that button, we call our retrieve item from ID, which is the function we just made. So set item details gets called to grab the data to populate our inventory menu. But retrieve item from ID, that does the more complicated stuff, is setting the actual object details once we've selected that item. And then I grab the object reference since it is now set after doing retrieve item from ID. You should probably do a validated get here or make sure that it exists, because if you do put an ID that's not in the data table, it will give you an error. And then you grab the item type from the object reference. And then if it's weapon or equipment, we determine if it's the item, weapon, or equipment. We don't need the cast that we had here anymore. We were casting to like default weapon, default equipment. We still do casts here because we need to set some variables or call some functions on them. But we were using it before to determine what type of item it is. Now we have that determined already, so we don't need to do the cast here. And instead, we can just go to the logic. Now, I didn't really adjust anything in here, so there's not a lot you have to worry about if you've been following the series. I'm not going to cover all this because it is quite a bit, but this is for attaching and detaching weapons. There is still a bug with it right now if this is in use, because of the fact that this just checks if the button has been pressed, not if a specific item is equipped. We will cover that in the next UI episode when we're going over the inventory UI and menu change, because I know exactly how I want to handle it. But I wanted to let you know. So that bug will still be there. There's not anything wrong that you did or anything that you missed or anything. But going off of this, the false branch here is in use for both the weapon and the equipment. Was going and it was spawning the object reference here. We no longer want to spawn that object reference here. So I just took that out and shifted everything over, because we're spawning it when we create the item instead now. We were waiting because we wanted to make sure it was the right item and we were in the right state to spawn it. But really, we just want to spawn it now when we press the button. Now, we do need to be careful because we do need to know if it's in use or not. But this is going to be removed in the next episode, as I said. So don't worry about that. We will make sure that we only spawn it if it's not equipped. We're going to add is equipped to the item, and then we'll figure it out from there. But it's too much to pack into this episode with everything else we already have. But now that we have the data table, we can just assign that to the class. We'll know exactly what item we're checking for if it's equipped, and then we can check it from there, like I said. So we'll fix that up later. I just want to let you know that guys could be aware of it. So we can take out the spawn actor here. We're not doing it there anymore. And we will worry about the rest next time, since we'll have a lot more time to address this sort of thing, and we'll be working in that class anyway. Cool. The very last thing about this, so if you took out the cast like I did, I was using default weapon and default equipment to cast here, then I still need equipment type here for how I'm doing my attaching and unattaching, or equipping and unequipping. So we still need to have a base equipment BP or some sort of way to know the equipment type for the switch statement. But you can manually cast here. It doesn't hurt to do a cast. The cast before was checking just to make sure it was the right type, whereas this cast is actually just to grab this variable from it. So if you took that out, you can no longer use that. You'll have to just do it here. You can see I just shifted everything over, added in this cast, and grabbed the equipment type. If you have any questions with this, as always, feel free to ask me on Discord or just as a YouTube comment. I'll be happy to help you out. But yeah, that's single inventory item widget adjusted for the data table. So now everything is in place. We're finally in a spot that I'm happy with. You know, I debated with this for a while. I was getting really tired of putting out inventory episodes and we weren't using the data table, because first of all, I love data tables, but second of all, I just felt that it was kind of going about it the wrong way, which, I mean, the method itself was fine, but if we're going for scalability, it's a good thing to use data tables and different things like that. So, you know, I just felt internally like I should have jumped to this, but I also wanted to wait for the right time. So hopefully, and thank you all for understanding and working with me through that, because I did have a little bit of trouble getting to that point. But now that we've done this, I feel very confident in what we have left to do. Mainly it's graphical things. UI, making it look nice and function nice on that end. The actual system should be pretty good. The only issue that I want to fix, I have 2 issues that I want to fix for the rest of the inventory episodes. So I want to fix the one where if you open up the inventory, you have something equipped. Then when you press it again, it doesn't just despawn on you. This is happening because of what I said with the is in use, and now that we're spawning it early. So obviously that needs to be adjusted. It'll be fixed next time because we're going to be going over all that. But the other thing that I want to fix is the collision. The collision is pretty good in terms of the actual overlap, but the problem is with some of the changes we made to our character's movement, now when we overlap with the sword like this, it will actually undo. You can see it's like kind of toggling on and off. And the reason for that is that's something I will also fix in next episode. I'll probably just have to add it in as an additional thing. I accidentally did not consider it when I was going over the character movement, so that's on me and I apologize, but it'll be fixed up. I'm aware of those 2 bugs, and I want to let you know from now on when I'm aware of things and when they should be fixed, so you guys can kind of plan for that. But yeah, I think that's just about everything. So I did want to show you guys something really quickly. So if we are to pick up a sword and spawn it. Now I have the sword that is spawned in the scene that we can pick up. And remember, I wasn't getting rid of it on purpose so I could add them to the inventory. Well, so we have 2 swords here. We have the one sword that was spawned and the one sword that's on the ground. And you can see the sword that's on the ground is this one. It has all the default values that we set in the class for the sword. These are the defaults, you know, because they don't have the yellow undo button next to it. The sword BP that is spawned and in the character's hand has this data. This data is the data from the data table. It's got the new damage and speed, the name, and the weight. And this logic, you know that it's the correct logic because this is what we did in the single inventory item retrieve item from ID. So we were setting all these variables here. We were setting it on the object that gets spawned. So that's how you know it's the spawned actor, and that's the reason we did that. We transferred the data from the structure and the data table into that object. Please subscribe. It does more for the channel and for me than anything else you can do. It just lets me know I'm doing a good job teaching and helping you guys, and it encourages me to keep working on this awesome game and all these awesome tutorials. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon subscribers and supporters. Thank you guys so much for continuing to support me and helping me with these awesome tutorials. Lastly, guys, if you want to check me out on Twitch, come play some games with me like Sekiro, then here's my Twitch channel. You can check it out. You can have a fun time playing some Souls games, watch me fail, and helping me learn good game mechanics along the way. Alright guys, that's all I got, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.